On the evening of March 11, 1983, inside a modest apartment on the fourth floor of a gray concrete building in East Berlin, a man named Victor Brandt opened his son's backpack to look for a permission slip. What he found instead was a piece of paper that would shatter every certainty he had built his life upon. The drawing was done in colored pencils, the work of a 7-year-old's hand-crude lines forming buildings, stick figures, and words written in a child's uneven script. But the words were not the vocabulary of a second grader. They were operational codes, coordinates, names of agents Victor had never spoken aloud, not even to his wife. And in the center of the drawing, a small figure with yellow hair, his son, Lucas, holding the hand of a man in black. At the bottom, in red crayon, the boy had written, "Help me, Papa." Victor's hands began to shake. The permission slip fell to the floor. The apartment, always too quiet, seemed to close in around him like a vault. He stared at the drawing as if it were a bomb that had already detonated, the shrapnel still traveling toward him in slow motion. For 12 years, Victor had worked for the Hauptverwaltung Aufklärung, the HVA, the Foreign Intelligence Division of the Stasi. He had been trained to compartmentalize, to separate his work from his life, to never bring the shadow of the state into his home. But the shadow had entered anyway. It had not come through the door, it had come through his son. Outside, the streets of Prenzlauer Berg were still. The winter had not yet released its grip on the city, and the cold seeped through the single-pane windows. Victor could hear the faint hum of a television from the apartment below, the sound muffled and indistinct. His wife Anna was in the kitchen washing dishes. She hummed softly to herself, unaware. Lucas was in his room playing with wooden blocks. The normalcy of it all felt obscene. Victor folded the drawing carefully and slid it into his coat pocket. He did not call out to Anna. He did not go to his son's room. He simply stood there, breathing slowly, trying to calculate how much time he had before the walls came down. The Cold War had taught the world to fear the visible enemy, the missiles, the soldiers, the tanks lined up at the border. But the true terror was always invisible. It lived in the space between what you said and what you thought. It resided in the gap between loyalty and survival. And it bred in the silence of people who had learned that the price of speaking was higher than the cost of remaining quiet. Victor had believed, for most of his adult life, that he understood this bargain. He had made his peace with it. He had traded his freedom for stability, his conscience for the safety of his family. But now, holding that drawing in his pocket like a death sentence, he realized he had never understood anything at all. The state did not make bargains. It made claims. And it had claimed his son, the German. Democratic Republic in 1983 was a nation of 17 million people living inside a carefully constructed illusion. The government insisted it was a workers' paradise, a bulwark against Western imperialism, a place where equality and justice reigned. The truth was far more mundane and far more suffocating. It was a place where neighbors reported neighbors, where children were taught to listen for dissent, where the Stasi employed more informants per capita than any secret police force in history. 1 in every 50 East Germans worked for the Ministry for State Security in some capacity, official or unofficial, paid or coerced. The surveillance was not a program. It was the architecture of daily life. Victor had been part of that architecture. He had helped build it, and now it had turned on him. He had been recruited in 1971, fresh out of university, a young man with a degree in linguistics and a talent for languages. The recruiter had been polite, almost fatherly. He had spoken of service, of the fatherland, of the invisible war being waged against enemies who wanted to see the DDR collapse. Victor, 22 years old and hungry for purpose, had signed the papers without hesitation. He was sent to a training facility near Potsdam, where he learned cryptography, surveillance techniques, and the art of reading people. He learned to lie so convincingly that even he could not always tell where the truth ended. He learned that the state valued loyalty above all else, and that loyalty meant obedience without question. For 12 years, he had obeyed. His work was never glamorous. He was not a field agent, not a recruiter, not someone who crossed borders or met contacts in darkened alleys. Victor was an analyst, a translator of intercepted communications. A man who sat in a windowless office and pieced together fragments of intelligence like a puzzle. He read letters that had been steamed open, transcripts of phone calls recorded without warrants, reports from informants who had betrayed friends and lovers. He learned things about people that no one should know, their fears, their secrets, their small rebellions, and he filed those things away in folders that would follow those people for the rest of their lives. He told himself it was necessary. He told himself it kept the peace. He told himself that the people he helped to surveil were threats, saboteurs, enemies of the state. But deep down, in a place he refused to examine, he knew that most of them were just people trying to live. Anna did not know the full extent of his work. She knew he worked for the government, something to do with translation and intelligence, but the details were classified. She did not ask questions. In the DDR, not asking questions was a form of love. They had met in 1974 at a party hosted by a mutual friend. She was a teacher, warm and practical, with dark hair and a laugh that made him feel, for the first time in years, like a human being instead of a function. They married 6 months later. Lucas was born in 1976, a small and serious baby who grew into a small and serious boy. Victor loved his son with a ferocity that surprised him. He had not known he was capable of such feeling. When he held Lucas for the first time in the sterile white room of the state hospital, he had made a silent promise. This boy would have a better life. This boy would be safe. But safety was a lie. Victor understood that now, safety was not something you earned through obedience. It was something the state allowed you to believe in, so long as you were useful. And when you stopped being useful or when you became a liability, the illusion shattered. The drawing in his pocket was proof of that. Someone had gotten to Lucas. Someone had used his son as a tool, a listening device, a means of gathering intelligence. And the most horrifying part was that Victor could not even be certain who. It could have been his own agency. It could have been a rival faction within the Stasi. It could have been the KGB, the Soviets who operated in the DDR with impunity. Or it could have been someone else entirely. Foreign intelligence service that had identified Victor as a potential target and decided to exploit his one vulnerability. He thought back over the past months, searching for signs he had missed. Had Lucas seemed different? Had he asked strange questions? Victor realized with a sinking feeling that he did not know. He had been so consumed by his work, so careful to keep his two lives separate, that he had stopped paying attention to the details of his son's world. He remembered Lucas's coming home from school and mentioning a new teacher, a man who sometimes stayed after class to help students with their homework. Victor had barely listened. He remembered Anna saying that Lucas had started drawing more, that he spent hours in his room with his pencils and paper. Victor had thought it was a good thing, a sign of creativity. Now he wondered what those drawings contained. What secrets had his son been trained to extract, and from whom? The apartment felt smaller with every breath. Victor moved to the window and looked down at the street. A black Lada was parked across the road, its engine idling. He could not see the driver, but he knew the car had not been there an hour ago. His mind began to race. If they were already watching him, then they knew he had found the drawing. If they knew he had found it, then they were waiting to see what he would do. And if they were waiting, then he had no time. He could not run. The borders were sealed, the wall insurmountable. He could not go to his superiors. If they were behind this, he would be arrested the moment he walked into headquarters. If they were not behind it, they would assume he was compromised and eliminate him anyway. The Stasi did not take chances. They did not investigate. They erased. His only option was to find out who had done this to his son and why. And to do that, he would have to become the very thing he had spent 12 years hunting, a traitor. Victor waited until Anna had gone to bed before he moved. He told her he had forgotten some paperwork at the office, that he would be back within the hour. She looked at him with tired eyes and nodded. She did not ask questions. He kissed her forehead, and for a moment he considered telling her everything. But he knew that would only endanger her further. Ignorance, in the DDR, was a form of protection. He went to Lucas's room and stood in the doorway, watching his son sleep. The boy's face was peaceful, his small chest rising and falling with each breath. Victor felt a surge of rage so intense it nearly brought him to his knees. Someone had violated this child. Someone had turned him into a weapon. And Victor would make them pay, even if it cost him everything. He left the apartment and walked quickly through the empty streets. The cold bit at his face, but he barely felt it. His mind was focused, calculating. He needed information, and there was only one person he could think of who might have it. A man named Ernst Kahler, a fellow analyst at the HVA who had worked with Victor for years. Ernst was older, cautious, and deeply cynical. He had survived 3 purges and 2 changes in leadership by keeping his head down and his mouth shut. But Victor had always sensed that Ernst knew more than he let on, that he had sources and connections that went deeper than official channels. If anyone could tell him what was happening, it was Ernst. Ernst lived alone in a cramped apartment near Alexanderplatz. Victor knocked on the door and waited. There was no answer. He knocked again, harder this time. Finally, he heard shuffling footsteps, and the door opened a crack. Ernst's face appeared, pale and gaunt in the dim light. He looked at Victor for a long moment, then stepped aside without a word. Victor entered, and Ernst closed the door behind him, securing 3 separate locks. The apartment smelled of cigarette smoke and old coffee. The walls were lined with books, most of them in Russian. A single lamp burned on a desk cluttered with papers. Ernst gestured for Victor to sit, but Victor remained standing. He pulled the drawing from his pocket and laid it on the desk. Ernst glanced at it, then looked up at Victor with an expression that was impossible to read. "Where did you get this?" Ernst asked quietly. "My son's backpack." Ernst's eyes narrowed. He picked up the drawing and studied it closely, his fingers tracing the lines. After a long silence, he set it down and lit a cigarette. He took a deep drag, exhaled slowly, and shook his head. "You're already dead," Ernst said. Victor felt the words like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" "This," Ernst said, tapping the drawing, "is not random. It's not a test. It's an execution method. They use children because children are invisible. No one suspects them. No one questions them. They train them to observe, to repeat what they hear, to draw what they see. And when the operation is complete, they dispose of the family." "All of them. Who?" Victor demanded. "Who is doing this?" Ernst hesitated. For the first time since Victor had known him, the older man looked afraid. "Department 12, he said finally. "A unit within the Stasi that officially doesn't exist. They handle internal purges, rival eliminations, and counterintelligence operations that are too dirty for the regular departments. They've been active since the late 70s, but they operate in complete secrecy. Even most of the ministry doesn't know about them." Victor's blood ran cold. "Why would they target me?" "I don't know," Ernst admitted. "But if they're using your son, it means they think you have information worth extracting, or they're setting you up to take the fall for something. Either way, you're a loose end. And Department 12 doesn't leave loose ends." Victor sat down slowly, his mind reeling. He thought of Lucas, asleep in his bed, unaware of the danger closing in around him. He thought of Anna, who had trusted him to keep their family safe. And he thought of the life he had built, the lies he had told himself, the compromises he had made. All of it had been for nothing. "What do I do?" Victor asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ernst stubbed out his cigarette and leaned back in his chair. "You have 2 options. You can go home, pretend you never saw the drawing, and hope they kill you quickly. Or you can fight back." He paused. "But if you fight, you have to be willing to burn everything down. Your career, your reputation, your life. And even then, you'll probably lose." Victor looked at the drawing, at his son's plea for help written in red crayon. He thought of all the people he had helped to surveil, all the lives he had helped to destroy. He had told himself it was duty. He had told himself it was necessary. But now, faced with the same machinery turned against his own family, he saw it for what it truly was, a system that devoured everyone, loyal and disloyal alike. "I'll fight," Victor said. Ernst nodded slowly. "Then you need to understand something. Department 12 operates out of a facility in Hohenschönhausen, but their records are kept off-site. There's a man named Werner Vogel who runs the logistics. He's paranoid, careful, but he has a weakness. He keeps physical copies of every operation, hidden in a safe house in Pankow. If you can get to those files, you might have leverage, but you'll need help. And the only people who can help you are the ones you've spent your career hunting." "The dissidents," Victor said. "The dissidents," Ernst confirmed. "There's a network operating in the city. They move people out, smuggle information to the West. They're careful, but they exist. If you can make contact, they might be able to get you what you need, but you have to move fast. Once Department 12 realizes, they'll accelerate the timeline." Victor stood. He felt as though he were standing at the edge of a cliff, staring down into darkness. Every instinct he had been trained to follow told him to stop, to go back, to submit. But when he thought of his son's face, of the trust in those small eyes, he knew there was no going back. "How do I find them?" Victor asked. Ernst walked to his bookshelf and pulled out a worn copy of Goethe's Faust. He opened it to a specific page and handed it to Victor. Inside was a phone number written in pencil. "Call this number from a payphone. Say you're looking for the librarian. They'll know what it means. After that, you're on your own." Victor took the book and slipped it into his coat. He looked at Ernst, this man who had survived by staying silent, and wondered what it had cost him. "Why are you helping me?" Ernst lit another cigarette. His hand trembled slightly. "Because I have a daughter," he said quietly. "She's 19. She wants to leave. She thinks the West is paradise. I've told her it's not, but she doesn't listen. Last week, someone from Department 12 came to see me. They wanted to know if I'd noticed anything unusual about her behavior. They wanted me to inform on my own child." He exhaled smoke and looked away. "I said no. And now, I'm waiting for them to come back." Victor felt a sudden kinship with this man, this stranger who had become his only ally. They were both fathers. They were both trapped. And they both knew that the system they had served would not spare them. "Thank you," Victor said. Ernst did not respond. He simply turned back to his desk, as if Victor had already left. Victor let himself out, securing the locks behind him. The street was empty, the black Lada still idling across from his building. Victor walked in the opposite direction, his mind already calculating his next move. He had crossed a line. There was no going back now. And somewhere in the darkness his son was waiting for him to come home. Victor walked for 20 minutes before he found a payphone that was both functional and isolated. It stood on a corner near Schanhauser Allee, beneath a flickering streetlight that cast long shadows across the empty pavement. The booth smelled of urine and cigarette ash. He fed coins into the slot and dialed the number Ernst had given him. The phone rang 4 times before someone picked up. There was no greeting, only silence and the faint sound of breathing on the other end. "I'm looking for the librarian," Victor said, keeping his voice steady. The line went dead. Victor stood there for a moment, uncertain whether he had failed or succeeded. Then the phone rang. He picked it up immediately. "Warschauer Strasse, U-Bahn station," a woman's voice said. "Platform 2, 30 minutes. Come alone. If you're followed, we disappear." The line went dead again. Victor replaced the receiver and stepped out of the booth. The cold air hit him like a slap. He checked his watch. It was just past midnight. The U-Bahn would still be running, but barely. He began walking, keeping to the side streets, doubling back twice to check for surveillance. The black Lada had not followed him from Ernst's building, but that meant nothing. The Stasi had thousands of informants, countless eyes. If they wanted to track him, they would. His only advantage was that they did not yet know what he intended to do. They were watching him, waiting for him to make a mistake. And he was about to give them one. The Warschauer Strasse station was nearly empty when he arrived. A handful of late-shift workers waited on the platform, their faces blank with exhaustion. Victor descended to Platform 2 and positioned himself near the far end, away from the others. He scanned the faces around him, looking for anyone who seemed too alert, too aware. But everyone looked half asleep, trapped in the dull rhythm of survival. The train arrived with a screech of metal on metal. The doors opened. People shuffled on and off. Victor remained where he was. As the train pulled away, he noticed a woman standing near the entrance to the platform. She was in her 30s, wearing a dark coat and a wool hat pulled low over her eyes. She glanced at him briefly, then looked away. A moment later, she turned and walked toward the exit. Victor followed. She led him through a series of back streets, moving quickly but without obvious urgency. She did not look back, did not acknowledge his presence. After 10 minutes, she stopped in front of a building that looked like it had been abandoned for years. The windows were boarded up, the entrance blocked by a rusted gate. She produced a key, unlocked the gate, and slipped inside. Victor hesitated for only a second before following. Inside, the building was dark and cold. He could hear water dripping somewhere in the distance. The woman moved through the darkness as if she could see perfectly, navigating hallways and stairwells with practiced ease. Victor followed the sound of her footsteps. Finally, she stopped in front of a door on the 3rd floor and knocked 3 times. The door opened from the inside. The room beyond was lit by a single kerosene lamp. 3 people were already there. A man in his 50s with graying hair and sharp eyes. A younger man who looked barely out of his teens, and an older woman who sat in the corner smoking a cigarette. They all turned to look at Victor as he entered. The woman who had led him here closed the door and locked it. "Who are you?" the older man asked. His voice was calm but edged with suspicion. "My name is Victor Brandt. I work for the HVA." The room went silent. The younger man stood up abruptly, his hand moving toward his pocket. The older man raised a hand to stop him. "You're Stasi," the older man said. It was not a question. "Yes," Victor said, "but I need your help." The older woman in the corner laughed bitterly. "A Stasi agent asking dissidents for help. I've heard everything now." "My son is in danger," Victor said, his voice tight. "They're using him. Department 12. They've trained him to spy on me, to extract information. I found a drawing he made. It had operational codes, agent names, things he couldn't possibly know unless someone taught him." He pulled the drawing from his pocket and held it up. He wrote, "Help me, Papa," at the bottom. "I don't know how much time I have, but I know that if I don't stop them, they'll kill him. They'll kill all of us." The older man studied Victor for a long moment. Then he gestured to the younger man, who stepped forward and took the drawing. He examined it under the lamplight, his expression unreadable. Finally, he handed it back to Victor and nodded to the older man. "It's real," the younger man said quietly. "The codes are current. Some of these names, I've seen them before. This is active intelligence." The older man leaned back against the wall and crossed his arms. "Why should we believe you? This could be a trap. You could be testing us, seeing if we'll expose ourselves." "I understand your suspicion," Victor said. "If I were in your position, I'd think the same thing. But I'm not asking you to trust me. I'm asking you to help a child. My son didn't choose this. He's 7 years old. He doesn't understand what they've done to him. And if I can't stop it, he'll either be killed or turned into something worse, a tool of the state, just like I became." The older woman stubbed out her cigarette and stood. She walked over to Victor and looked him in the eye. "What do you want from us?" "I need to get into a safe house in Pankow," Victor said. "Department 12 keeps records there. Files on their operations. If I can find my son's file, I can figure out who's running this and what their endgame is, but I can't do it alone. I need someone who knows how to move through the city without being seen. Someone who can get me in and out." The older man and the woman exchanged a glance. The younger man shifted uncomfortably. Finally, the older man spoke. "If we help you, and this goes wrong, it won't just be you who suffers. They'll come for all of us, our families, everyone we've ever spoken to. Do you understand that?" "Yes," Victor said. "And I wouldn't ask if I had any other choice." but I don't. My son is running out of time. And I think, he paused, choosing his words carefully, I think Department 12 isn't just targeting me. I think they're running a broader operation, something that involves multiple families, multiple children. If we can expose it, we might be able to stop them. But we have to move now. The older man was silent for a long time. Then he sighed and nodded. My name is Peter. This is my daughter, Katrin. He gestured to the woman who had led Victor here. The boy is Stefan, and the woman in the corner is Margot. We've been helping people escape the DDR for 6 years. We've lost friends, we've lost family, but we've saved more than we've lost. He looked at Victor with something that might have been pity. You're walking into hell, you know that, right? I've been living in hell, Victor said. I just didn't realize it until tonight. Peter nodded slowly. All right, we'll help you. But we do this my way. You follow my instructions exactly. If I say stop, you stop. If I say run, you run. And if this goes south, you don't mention our names. You don't mention this place. You take the fall alone. Understood? Understood, Victor said. Peter turned to Katrin. Get the maps. We need to plan a route into Pankow. Margot, you're on watch. Stefan, go check the perimeter. Make sure we weren't followed. The group moved with practiced efficiency, each person knowing their role. Victor stood there, feeling like an intruder in a world he had spent years trying to destroy. These people were everything he had been trained to fear, enemies of the state, subversives, traitors. But they were also the only ones willing to help him save his son. The irony was not lost on him. Katrin spread a map of East Berlin across a makeshift table. She traced a route with her finger, pointing out checkpoints, patrol patterns, and surveillance cameras. The safe house is here, she said, tapping a spot in northern Pankow. It's in a residential area, which makes it harder to approach undetected, but there's a pattern to the patrols. They sweep every 2 hours. If we time it right, we'll have a 15-minute window. What about inside? Victor asked. Security systems? Guards? We don't know, Peter admitted. We've never had reason to go near it. But if it's Department 12, you can assume it's heavily secured. Alarms, locks, possibly armed personnel. Victor thought for a moment. I can get past the locks. I was trained in infiltration techniques, but I'll need tools. Margot, who had returned from her watch, reached into a bag and pulled out a small leather case. She tossed it to Victor. Inside were lockpicks, wire cutters, and a small flashlight. Don't lose those, she said. They're hard to replace. Victor nodded. When do we go? Tonight, Peter said. If Department 12 is already watching you, waiting won't make things safer. It'll just give them more time to prepare. We leave in 1 hour. Katrin will take you in. The rest of us will provide distractions and cover your exit route. If you're not out in 30 minutes, we assume you've been compromised and we disappear. And if I am compromised? Victor asked. Peter met his eyes. Then you're on your own. The next hour passed in tense silence. Victor sat in the corner, going over the route in his mind, memorizing street names and landmarks. Katrin cleaned a knife methodically, her movements precise and practiced. Stefan paced near the window, occasionally glancing out into the darkness. Margot smoked another cigarette, her eyes distant. Peter studied the map, making small notations with a pencil. When the hour was up, Peter stood and folded the map. It's time. They left the building in pairs, staggered by 5-minute intervals. Victor and Katrin went last. The streets were empty now, the city locked in the stillness that came just before dawn. They moved quickly, keeping to the shadows, avoiding the main roads. Katrin knew every alley, every shortcut, every blind spot. She moved like a ghost, silent and invisible. Victor struggled to keep up, his body unused to this kind of exertion. His work had been sedentary, intellectual. But adrenaline pushed him forward, and fear kept him sharp. They reached the edge of Pankow just as the first patrol passed by. Katrin pulled Victor into a doorway, pressing him against the wall. 2 Volkspolizei officers walked past, their flashlights sweeping the street. Victor held his breath. The officers continued on without stopping. Katrin waited another 30 seconds, then stepped back into the street. They moved again, faster now. The safe house came into view 10 minutes later. It was a nondescript building, indistinguishable from the dozens of others around it. No lights were on inside. No cars were parked nearby. It looked abandoned. But Victor knew better. Places that looked abandoned were often the most dangerous. Katrin stopped a block away and pointed. "That's it. You have 15 minutes starting now. I'll be here waiting. If you're not back by then, I leave." Victor nodded. He crossed the street and approached the building from the side, staying low. The front door was locked, but there was a side entrance partially hidden by overgrown shrubs. He knelt and examined the lock. It was a standard pin tumbler, nothing sophisticated. He pulled out the lockpick set and went to work. His hands trembled slightly, but the muscle memory was still there. After 90 seconds, the lock clicked open. He slipped inside and closed the door behind him. The interior was dark and smelled of dust and mildew. Victor turned on the small flashlight, keeping the beam low. He was in a narrow hallway. Doors lined both sides. He moved forward slowly, checking each room. Most were empty, stripped of furniture and personality. But at the end of the hall, he found a door that was locked from the outside. He picked the lock and pushed the door open. Inside was a small office, a desk, a filing cabinet, and a wall covered with maps and photographs. Victor's heart began to pound. He crossed to the filing cabinet and tried the drawer. It was locked. He picked it quickly and pulled it open. Inside were dozens of folders, each labeled with a code. He began flipping through them, searching for anything related to his son or his family. It took him 5 minutes to find it. The folder was labeled Operation Kindermärchen, Operation Fairy Tale. He pulled it out and opened it. The first page was a briefing document. It outlined the operation's objective: to identify and neutralize potential internal threats within the HVA by using the children of analysts as unwitting intelligence-gathering tools. The children were selected based on their age, young enough to be trained without resistance, old enough to understand and repeat information. They were approached by operatives posing as teachers, coaches, or family friends. Over a period of months, they were conditioned to observe their parents, to ask specific questions, and to report back using drawings or simple verbal cues. The parents were never informed. If the child successfully extracted actionable intelligence, the family was marked for elimination. If the child failed, they were deemed useless, and the operation was quietly terminated. It was systematic, efficient, and utterly monstrous. Victor turned the page and found a list of names. There were 23 families on the list. His was third from the top. Next to each name was a status update. Most were marked active. 3 were marked terminated. Victor felt sick. He flipped through more pages, finding reports on each child's progress, transcripts of their conversations, and photographs. There was a picture of Lucas, taken from a distance, playing in a park. Victor's hands shook as he stared at his son's face. He forced himself to keep reading. The operation was being run by a man named Werner Vogel, the same name Ernst had mentioned. Vogel reported directly to a deputy minister whose identity was redacted. The operation had been active for 2 years. It had already resulted in the arrests of 4 analysts and the execution of 2 families. Victor felt a cold rage building inside him. These people had used children as weapons. They had turned innocence into something poisonous. And they had done it with bureaucratic precision, as if they were managing a budget or filing a report. He took the entire folder and stuffed it into his coat. He needed to leave, needed to get this information out. But as he turned to go, he heard footsteps in the hallway. He froze. The footsteps were slow, deliberate. They stopped outside the door. Victor's mind raced. There was no other exit, no window. He was trapped. The door opened. A man stood silhouetted in the doorway, holding a pistol. The man reached for the light switch. The room flooded with harsh fluorescent light. Victor blinked, his eyes adjusting. The man stepped inside and closed the door behind him. He was in his 40s, wearing a dark suit, his face impassive. "Victor Brandt," the man said. "I was wondering when you'd show up." Victor said nothing. His mind was calculating distances, angles, possibilities. The man with the gun seemed to sense this and shook his head. "Don't," he said. "You won't make it. And even if you did, there are 3 more outside." He gestured to the chair behind the desk. "Sit down." Victor sat. The man remained standing, the gun never wavering. "My name is Werner Vogel," the man said. "I imagine you've seen my work by now." He glanced at the folder in Victor's coat. "You're a smart man, Victor. Smarter than most. That's why we chose you." "Chose me for what?" Victor asked, keeping his voice steady. "To fail," Vogel said simply. "You were identified 2 years ago as a potential liability. Your psychological profile suggested you had residual empathy, a weakness for family, a tendency toward independent thought, all red flags. But instead of purging you immediately, we decided to use you. We ran an operation to test your loyalty. We trained your son to extract information from you. And we waited to see how long it would take you to notice." Victor felt the blood drain from his face. "You wanted me to find out." "Of course," Vogel said. "If you hadn't found the drawing, we would have planted another clue. The point was to push you into making a choice to see if you would come to us, confess, and beg for mercy, or if you would do exactly what you did, reach out to dissidents, betray your oath, and confirm that you were never truly loyal to begin with." He smiled coldly. "You passed the test, Victor, or rather you failed it, which means you're no longer useful." Victor's mind raced. He was going to die here. They had orchestrated everything, from the moment Lucas brought home the first drawing to the phone number Ernst had given him. It had all been a trap. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, a small part of his mind remained calculating. Vogel was talking. He was explaining. And people who felt the need to explain were either arrogant or uncertain. "What happens to my son?" Victor asked quietly. Vogel's smile faded. "Your son will be placed in a state facility. He'll be re-educated, given a new identity, and eventually integrated into a new family. He won't remember you. Children are resilient that way." "And my wife?" "Collateral damage," Vogel said with a shrug. "Unfortunate, but necessary." Victor looked down at his hands. They were still trembling. He thought of Lucas, of Anna, of the life he had tried to build. And he thought of all the people he had helped to destroy, all the families he had torn apart with his reports and his translations. He had told himself it was duty. He had told himself it was necessary. But now, sitting across from a man who spoke of murder as if it were a budget line, he saw himself clearly for the first time. He had been a coward. He had traded his soul for safety. And now there was no safety left. "You're going to kill me," Victor said. It was not a question. "Yes," Vogel said. "But you have a choice in how it happens. You can cooperate. Tell us everything about the dissidents you've contacted tonight. Give us names and locations, and I'll make it quick. Or you can refuse, and we'll take our time. Either way, the result is the same." Victor looked up at Vogel. For the first time in years, he felt something close to clarity. He had spent his entire adult life afraid of the state, afraid of failure, afraid of stepping out of line. But fear was a choice, and he was done choosing it. "I won't tell you anything," Victor said. Vogel sighed. "I was afraid you'd say that." He raised the gun, and then the lights went out. The darkness was absolute. Victor heard the sharp intake of Vogel's breath, the slight shuffle of his feet as he adjusted his stance. Then came the sound of breaking glass from somewhere in the building, followed by shouting. Vogel cursed and moved toward the door. Victor didn't think. He launched himself from the chair, driving his shoulder into where he thought Vogel's body would be. He connected hard, and both men went down. The gun clattered across the floor. Victor's hands found Vogel's throat, but Vogel was trained too. He brought his knee up into Victor's stomach, driving the air from his lungs. They rolled, grappling in the darkness, each trying to gain the advantage. Victor's fingers closed around something metallic, the gun. He grabbed it just as Vogel's fist connected with his jaw. Stars exploded across his vision. Vogel tried to wrench the weapon away, but Victor held on with desperate strength. They struggled for what felt like hours, but was probably only seconds. Then Victor managed to twist the barrel toward Vogel and pull the trigger. The shot was deafening in the enclosed space. Vogel's body went rigid, then slack. Victor pushed himself away, gasping for air, his hands slick with something warm. He couldn't tell if it was his blood or Vogel's. The shouting grew louder. Victor forced himself to his feet, still clutching the gun. He stumbled toward where he remembered the door being and found it. The hallway was chaos. Smoke filled the air, and he could see figures moving through it, Peter's people, creating the distraction they had promised. Someone grabbed his arm. It was Katrin. "Move!" she shouted. They ran through the building, following a path that seemed to have been cleared ahead of them. Victor heard more gunshots behind them, the sound of boots on concrete. They burst through a back exit into an alley. Stefan was there with a car, engine running. Katrin shoved Victor into the back seat and jumped in after him. The car lurched forward before the door was even closed. "The others?" Victor managed to ask between gasps. "They'll meet us at the secondary location," Stefan said, taking corners at dangerous speeds. If they can, the car raced through the pre-dawn streets of East Berlin. Victor looked down at his hands. They were shaking violently. The gun was still in his grip. Katrin gently took it from him and wiped it clean with a cloth before throwing it out the window into the Spree River as they crossed a bridge. Victor realized he was still holding the folder operation, Kindermärchen. He had somehow kept it through the entire struggle. They drove for 20 minutes, switching cars twice, before finally pulling into an underground garage beneath what looked like an abandoned warehouse. Peter and Margot were already there, along with two others Victor hadn't seen before. Peter's face was grim, a cut above his left eye bleeding freely. "We lost Hans," Peter said quietly. "They shot him as we were pulling out." Margot turned away, her shoulders shaking. Victor felt the weight of another death on his conscience. A man he had never met was dead because Victor had asked for help. But there was no time for grief now. He pulled out the folder and laid it on a makeshift table. "This is what they were running," Victor said, his voice hoarse. "Operation Kindermärchen. They used children to spy on their own parents. 23 families were targeted. Mine was just one of them." Peter picked up the folder and began reading, his expression growing darker with each page. When he finished, he looked at Victor with something that might have been respect. "This is bigger than we thought. This isn't just about purging internal threats. This is about control. They're teaching children that betrayal is normal, that family loyalty means nothing compared to loyalty to the state. They're breeding the next generation of informants. We need to get this out," Katrin said, "to the West, to journalists who can publish it." "It won't matter," Margot said bitterly. "The West already knows what the Stasi does. They've known for decades. One more atrocity won't change anything." "She's right," Peter said. "Publishing this might embarrass the regime, but it won't stop them. They'll just run the operation under a different name with better security." He looked at Victor. "The only way to truly stop this is to destroy the program from the inside. To make them afraid to continue." Victor understood what Peter was suggesting. "You want me to go back? To use this information as leverage?" "Not leverage," Peter corrected. "Insurance. You make copies. You distribute them to multiple people, dissidents, foreign journalists, even sympathetic officials within the regime. You let it be known that if anything happens to you or your family, everything gets released. They might still come after you, but they'll have to think twice. And more importantly, the other analysts on that list will know what's happening to their children. Some of them will resist. The operation will become too costly to maintain." Victor thought of Lucas, asleep in his bed, unaware that his entire world was about to collapse. He thought of Anna, who deserved a husband who told her the truth, and he thought of the 19 other families still trapped in this nightmare. "How long do I have?" Victor asked. "Hours, maybe," Peter said. "They'll be looking for you, but they won't make a move until they know whether you talked or not. Right now, you have uncertainty on your side. Use it." Stefan had been working at a desk in the corner, and he now brought over a stack of papers. "I made 10 copies of the key documents. I'll get them to our contacts in the West by morning. But you'll need to keep the originals. Victor took the copies and the original folder. He felt like he was holding a bomb. In a way, he was. This information could destroy careers, topple officials, maybe even shake the regime itself. But it could also destroy his family if he played it wrong. "There's one more thing," Peter said. "Your son. They said they'll take him to a state facility, but that probably won't happen immediately. Right now, they're using him to bait you. They'll assume you'll try to run, to take him with you. That's when they'll grab you both. So what do I do?" Victor asked. "You go home," Peter said. "You act like nothing has happened. You go to work tomorrow like always, and you wait. When they come for you, and they will come, you show them what you have. You make it clear that their operation is compromised and that continuation means exposure. You force them to negotiate." "They don't negotiate," Victor said. "You said it yourself. They eliminate threats." "Usually, yes," Peter agreed. "But you're not the usual threat. You're one of their own. You have information that could damage multiple departments. And most importantly, you didn't run. Running makes you a traitor. Staying makes you a problem they have to solve carefully." He paused. "It's not a guarantee. Nothing is. But it's the best chance you have of keeping your family alive." Victor nodded slowly. He looked at the people around him, dissidents, criminals in the eyes of the state, the very people he had once hunted. And yet they had risked their lives to save his son. He felt a debt he could never repay. "Thank you," Victor said. "All of you. I know it doesn't change what I've done, what I was, but thank you." Katrine stepped forward. "What you were doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what you do next." She handed him a small card with a phone number written on it. "If things go wrong, if you need to run, call this number. We can get you and your family out. It won't be easy, and you'll lose everything, but you'll be alive." Victor took the card and memorized the number before burning it in an ashtray. He understood now why these people fought. It wasn't because they believed they could win. It was because surrendering meant accepting that there was no such thing as human dignity, no such thing as choice. And even in the darkest corners of the DDR, people refused to accept that. The sun was rising as Stefan drove Victor back toward his neighborhood. They stopped 3 blocks from his building. Victor got out and walked the rest of the way, the folder of documents hidden inside his coat. The black Lada was still parked across from his building, but now there was a second car. Victor walked past them without looking, climbed the stairs to his apartment, and let himself in. Anna was in the kitchen making coffee. She looked up as he entered, her eyes red from lack of sleep. "Where have you been? I was so worried." Victor put down his coat carefully and went to her. He took her hands in his and looked into her eyes. "Anna, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen without interrupting." For the next hour, Victor told his wife everything. He told her about his work, about what he really did for the HVA. He told her about Operation Kindermärchen, about what had been done to Lucas. He showed her the folder, let her read the documents. He watched her face cycle through disbelief, horror, rage, and finally a terrible kind of understanding. When he finished, she sat in silence for a long time. "They used our son," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes. And they were going to kill us. Yes." She looked up at him, and Victor saw something in her eyes he had never seen before, not anger, not fear, but a fierce, protective determination. "What do we do?" "We survive," Victor said. "We make them understand that killing us costs more than letting us live. And we get Lucas away from whoever has been training him." Anna stood and walked to Lucas's room. Victor followed. Their son was awake now, sitting on his bed with a coloring book. He looked up as they entered, and Victor saw something in the boy's eyes. A guardedness that shouldn't have been there, a calculation too adult for a 7-year-old. "Lucas," Victor said gently, sitting on the edge of the bed. "I need to ask you about your teacher, the new one, the man who stays after school." Lucas's face remained neutral, but his hands tightened on the coloring book. "Herr Schmidt?" "Yes." "What does Herr Schmidt talk to you about?" "School," Lucas said. "And games." "He teaches us memory games." "What kind of memory games?" Lucas hesitated. Victor could see the conflict in his small face. The conditioning telling him not to share. The natural trust of a child wanting to please his father. He shows us pictures and asks us to remember them. Then he asks us questions about what we saw. What kind of pictures? Anna asked, kneeling beside the bed. Buildings, people, sometimes papers with writing on them. Lucas looked down. He said it was important. That smart children help their country by remembering things. Victor felt his heart break. They had weaponized his son's intelligence, turned his desire to be helpful into something monstrous. He reached out and pulled Lucas into his arms, holding him tight. The boy remained stiff for a moment, then suddenly relaxed and began to cry, deep, wrenching sobs that seemed to come from somewhere ancient. "I'm sorry, Papa," Lucas choked out. "I tried to be smart. I tried to help. But it felt wrong. It felt like lying." "You didn't do anything wrong," Victor said fiercely. "You hear me? None of this is your fault. Never, never your fault." They stayed like that for a long time. The three of them holding each other in the small bedroom while the morning light crept through the window. Victor knew that men in cars outside were watching, that reports were being filed, that decisions were being made about their future. But for this moment, they were just a family trying to survive the machinery of a state that saw them only as functions to be used or eliminated. At noon, Victor went to work. He walked into HVA headquarters as if it were any other day, nodded to the security guards, took the elevator to his floor. His colleagues glanced at him but said nothing. He sat at his desk and opened a file, pretending to work. He waited. At 2 o'clock, his supervisor appeared at his cubicle. "Herr Brandt, there are some people who would like to speak with you." Victor stood and followed his supervisor to a conference room. 3 men were waiting inside. He recognized one of them, a senior officer from Department 12. The other 2 were unfamiliar, but their bearing marked them as security personnel. They did not ask him to sit. "You were at a location in Pankow last night," the senior officer said. It was not a question. "Yes," Victor said. "Werner Vogel is dead." "Yes." The officer studied him for a long moment. "You killed a decorated officer of the Ministry for State Security. That is a capital offense." Victor reached into his jacket slowly, watching the security personnel tense. He pulled out the folder and laid it on the conference table. "This is Operation Kindermärchen. Complete files on 23 families, including mine. Documentation of how Department 12 has been using children as intelligence assets. Training procedures. Success and failure rates. Names of personnel involved, including Werner Vogel." The senior officer's face remained impassive, but Victor saw the slight tightening around his eyes. "That is classified material." "Possession of it is insurance," Victor interrupted. "Copies of this file are currently in the possession of multiple individuals both inside and outside the DDR. If anything happens to me, my wife, or my son, everything gets released. To Western journalists, to the UN, to officials within our own government who might find this operation distasteful." He paused. "I imagine the use of children as intelligence weapons would be difficult to justify, even internally." The room was silent. The security personnel looked to the senior officer, waiting for instructions. The officer picked up the folder and leafed through it slowly. When he finished, he set it down and looked at Victor with something that might have been respect or might have been contempt. "You've put yourself in an impossible position," the officer said. "We cannot allow you to continue working here. Your clearance is revoked. But we also cannot arrest you without triggering the release you've described." He leaned forward. "So here is what will happen. You will resign from the HVA, effective immediately, for personal reasons. You will never speak of your work to anyone. You will never contact foreign intelligence services or anti-state elements. You and your family will remain in the DDR under permanent surveillance, and Operation Kindermärchen will be terminated." "All 23 families?" Victor pressed. The officer's jaw tightened. "All of them. I want confirmation," Victor said. "Within 48 hours. I want proof that every child on that list has been removed from the program and that no further contact has been made. You're not in a position to make demands." "Neither are you," Victor said quietly. Because if I disappear, if my family is harmed, if anything happens that suggests the operation is continuing, everything comes out. And the people who approve this program will have questions to answer. They stared at each other across the conference table. Finally, the officer nodded once. 48 hours. You'll receive confirmation through unofficial channels. After that, we're done. You go back to being a translator, a teacher, whatever you want. But you disappear from our world. Understood? Understood. Victor was escorted from the building. He surrendered his badge, his access cards, his official identification. He signed papers that he didn't bother reading. And then he walked out into the cold afternoon air as a private citizen for the first time in 12 years. The black Lada was still parked across the street, but it no longer mattered. He had become exactly what they feared most, not a traitor who ran, but a threat who stayed. 46 hours later, Victor received an envelope slipped under his door. Inside was a single sheet of paper with 23 names, the families from Operation Kindermärchen. Each name had a stamped notation: terminated program, discontinued. There was no signature, no official seal, nothing that could be used as evidence. But Victor knew it was real. The Stasi did not make empty promises. The program was over. The weeks that followed were strange. Victor found work as a translator for a publishing house, reviewing technical manuals and academic papers. It was boring, safe, and honest. Anna returned to teaching. Lucas slowly began to act like a child again, the guardedness fading as the months passed. They were watched, always. The Stasi maintained a file on them, tracked their movements, noted their contacts. But they were left alone. Victor had become a problem that had been solved by being rendered harmless. He never contacted Peter or the dissidents again. He knew they were still out there, still fighting, still helping people escape. But that was no longer his world. His world was smaller now. His wife, his son, his work, his apartment. It was enough. It had to be enough. In 1989, when the wall fell and the DDR collapsed, Victor was not surprised. He had seen the rot from the inside, had understood that a system built on fear and surveillance could not sustain itself indefinitely. When the Stasi headquarters were stormed and the files were opened, he and Anna went to see their own records. The folders were massive, containing decades of surveillance, reports from neighbors and colleagues, transcripts of private conversations. But what struck Victor most was Lucas's file, dozens of pages documenting his progress in Operation Kindermärchen. His drawings carefully preserved, his words recorded with clinical precision. They took the files home and burned them in the courtyard of their building. Other families did the same, creating small bonfires of paper and memory. It felt like an exorcism, a purging of the past. But Victor knew that some things could never be burned away. The knowledge of what had been done would remain. The guilt would remain. And the question that haunted him most would remain: how many other children, in other times, in other places, were being used the same way? Lucas grew up to be a teacher, like his mother. He specialized in ethics and critical thinking, teaching students to question authority and to value human dignity above obedience. He never spoke publicly about what had happened to him as a child, but Victor knew it had shaped him. In a way, Department 12 had succeeded in creating something with their operation, not an informant, not a weapon, but a man who understood viscerally the cost of surrendering one's conscience to the state. Victor lived long enough to see the reunification of Germany, the trial of Stasi officers, and the slow, painful process of a nation confronting its past. He gave testimony at several trials, always carefully, always aware that many of his former colleagues were still alive and that old loyalties died hard. He was never celebrated as a hero. Most people saw him as what he was: a man who had served a monstrous system until it threatened his own family, then acted to save himself. He accepted that judgment. It was fair. On a cold morning in November 2004, Victor died in his sleep. He was 73 years old. Anna found him in their bed, peaceful, as if he had simply decided it was time to stop. The funeral was small family, a few friends, some of Lucas's students who had heard enough about Victor to want to pay their respects. No government officials attended. No one gave speeches about his service to the state. He was buried in a cemetery on the outskirts of Berlin, beneath a simple stone that bore his name and the dates of his life. After the funeral, Lucas found among his father's possessions a sealed envelope addressed to him. Inside was a letter, written in Victor's careful script. It was not long. It said, "My son, by the time you read this, I will be gone. I write this not to seek forgiveness. I know that some things cannot be forgiven, but to leave you with a truth I learned too late. The greatest danger in any society is not the obviously evil men, but the ordinary ones who convince themselves that their small compromises serve a greater good. I was one of those men. I told myself that my work protected people, that the surveillance and control were necessary to maintain peace. I was wrong. Peace built on fear is no peace at all. It is merely the silence of people too afraid to scream. You were 7 years old when they tried to turn you into a tool of the state. You were innocent, and they violated that innocence in ways that cannot be undone. I failed to protect you until it was almost too late. That failure will haunt me for whatever time I have left. But I want you to know that you saved me as much as I saved you. Your drawing, your plea for help, woke me from a sleep I did not even know I was in. You reminded me that there are things more important than survival, more sacred than obedience. Never forget what was done to you. Never forget how easily systems can corrupt the innocent. But also, never forget that individuals can choose to resist, even when resistance seems impossible. You have built a life dedicated to teaching others to think critically, to question, to value truth over comfort. That is the best revenge against those who tried to shape you into something small and obedient. Be proud of who you have become. Be wary of anyone who asks you to surrender your conscience for security. And when you have children of your own, tell them the truth, not to burden them, but to inoculate them against the lies that every generation must face. I love you. I've failed you. Both things are true. Carry that complexity forward and never let anyone tell you that the world is simple or that history has ended. Your father. Lucas read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his wallet, where it would remain for the rest of his life. He did not cry. He had done his crying years ago in his small bedroom in East Berlin, in his father's arms. But he understood something in that moment that he had never quite articulated before. His father had not been a hero or a villain. He had been a human being, capable of both great cowardice and great courage, trapped in a system designed to extract both. And that, perhaps, was the most important lesson. The Cold War had ended, but the machinery of control, surveillance, and fear had not. It had simply changed forms, adapted to new technologies, found new justifications. The question was not whether such systems would exist, but how ordinary people would respond when confronted with their power. Would they comply, hoping for safety? Would they resist, knowing the cost? Or would they, like Victor, wait until it was almost too late before finding the courage to act? If stories like this make you reflect on how fragile freedom really is, consider what price you would pay to protect it. Not just from obvious tyrants, but from the small compromises that seem reasonable until the day you realize you've surrendered everything that mattered. There are many more stories like Victor's stories, of people who served systems they didn't fully understand, who made choices they couldn't unmake, who discovered too late that obedience and safety are not the same thing. These stories deserve to be remembered, not because they provide easy answers, but because they ask difficult questions. Questions we must continue to ask if we want to build a world where children are allowed to remain children, where families are not weapons, and where the price of security is not the surrender of our souls. The Cold War ended, but the war for human dignity continues. And it is fought not on battlefields or in secret facilities, but in the small choices we make every day to speak or to stay silent, to comply or to question, to see others as tools or as people. Victor Brandt learned that lesson in the hardest way possible. May we learn it more gently,